In our case, we as well look at three different aspects of your application. So artistic merit is the most heavily rated. But it's the same thing, it's artistic impact, and that also can include, further to what you mentioned, it can also include impact on your discipline. Yes. So depending in what genres you work in, if you do something that's really innovative, something like that will be considered as well. And same for us, we look at effective planning. It's what you propose, are you actually able to do it with the budget that you're, proposing it with, and just is it viable? Will you achieve what you set out to achieve based on how you propose to go about it? So that's in addition to the artistic merit of just the project itself.
And also, you kind of have to think about the order in which you apply. You can't just apply for a tour but have no material to support it. A lot of times you should apply first for an individual creation grant so that you have time to either study with a master or create some music, then move on to a recording, because if you have a CD, it's easier to travel or to tour. And that way, you're entering the funding stream possibly as an emerging artist, and then moving on from there, impacting your career as you go, because you have to think of, if I write my music first, what's the next step? If I record, what's the next step after that? So you need to think in those aspects in order to help your career, and always call an officer that's responsible for the program, and ask questions to see the types of you can ask about how a jury would perceive your project, or if you write it in a certain way, or it might skim the eligibility criteria. You may have to think about, like, there are certain aspects of a project that are not eligible. So you have to, read the guidelines carefully and speak to an officer before you apply, because you don't just want to get after a letter telling you that you didn't even make it to committee because you didn't ask the right questions first.
But I just want to speak to that too, when you're looking at, say, 400 applications at a deadline, the volume can be very high. So I know for us, it can be, in a really worst case scenario, 48 hours, but we do to get back to you, and that would be very worst case. But an email, just depends on what's happening at the time. Sometimes it goes to junk mail, so like anything, some people get discouraged, and then you say, like at that stage, and it might have just gone to our junk mail or something. So
all the programs have deadlines.
Yes,
and that's the most important thing. And it takes how long before they'll receive notification on if they received a grant?
So in our case, the deadline was in January, and results are being announced beginning of July.
Wow, that's good.
That's 7 months. So all of the programs at the OAC are maximum 4 months from the time you apply till the time you get your notification. It's usually faster, but technically 4 months is what we say. That's for the majority. There are micro grant programs, but I'm not going to speak to that right now.
Or ours is 4 to 5 months after the deadline, depending on the program. We have several deadlines. When it comes to travel grants, it's roughly 8 to 12 weeks after the deadline. The Aboriginal People's Music Travel Grants does not have deadlines, but you must submit prior to your travel, and we encourage you as much as possible, at least 6 weeks prior to your travel. We know that's not always possible. We've had applications received while they were at the airport. So these kinds of things happen.
So the reason why I wanted them to point that out is when you're planning your project, you also have to plan those 4 to 7 months of waiting before you receive that money. So some people will apply and they've already started their project, and that is normally...
In our case, you can do it as long as the portion that you're applying for doesn't happen before the application deadline. So if it's after the application deadline, so for example, you could have somebody who wants to do a demo recording and it happened in February, that's okay, they can apply. It's because we only have one funding deadline, so it just is what it is. So as long as it doesn't happen before the application deadline, it's fine. It's a risk the artist is willing to take if they apply. They may get funding, they may not. Yeah, they'll have to wait to find out, but it is eligible in our case.
So at the OAC, this is where the nuances come in, and it's good to call for projects. For music projects, that is fine also. So you can apply retroactively, and that's just because of the nature that a lot of people are engaging with other musicians, and say you come across someone who's going to do your start your demo, and it's location specific, but all the other programs it's not. So these are the tiny little details that are good to find out that you want to have prepared if you're talking to an officer.
At the Canada Council, there is no retroactive funding, although almost all of our programs have multiple deadlines. So you just have to think ahead of time and determine what your project is, speak to an officer, and then they can tell you, well, if you want to do it in June of next year, then say for recording, then you've got the October 1st deadline, or you can wait till the May after, which still gives you lots of time. But if you want to find out whether or not you're going to get funding, then I suggest the October deadline. That'll give you enough time to figure out if you need to look somewhere else for your funding.
Yeah, and some of the programs will actually tell you in a little bracket, if you're applying to this deadline, it's for projects that take place during this time frame. So I mean, it's kind of interesting. And there's also some other sort of regulations around how many grants you can apply for in a year, and so everybody has their nuances with that, so maybe you could touch on that as well.
For the City of Ottawa, and again, keep in mind that things like this can change, but currently it is that you can only apply for a project every 2 years. So, and again, it gets complicated because some projects take longer than a year. But so if you applied for funding and you got funding in the 2013 funding cycle, you can apply again in 2015.
And if you didn't get funding,
you can apply next year.
So OAC, you could apply as an individual to, I guess, technically every single one of our programs in a year, if it was clearly for separate activities. Sometimes, if it's a lot of activity, and once in a while you see artists who are putting in big projects, and then that's coming up and other artists know about it, then they might say, I don't understand how they're going to do this because I know they're working on this project. So I was just joking around there, but as long as it's clearly for separate activity, and then you cannot reapply to that program till you've finished it and reported on it, which is part of the fiscal responsibility. If you get a grant, then you are required to send in your budget actuals and statistics and sign off. And then once that's complete, then you can apply again to that same program.
But if you have an outstanding grant,
Then you
or
can't
final
apply
report, I mean.
in a program.
Yeah, you can.
At the Canada Council, you are allowed to receive 2 grants within a 48-month period, and within 4 years. So some people will receive 2 grants in 1 year, and then, well, you have to wait a while before you're eligible. Except for travel grants, you're allowed to apply once a year for a travel grant. And for most of our programs, you cannot apply to 2 consecutive deadlines. So if you were unsuccessful, let's say at the November deadline for professional musicians, individuals, then you cannot apply to the March deadline. You'll have to wait till the next November.